Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Climate Change Commission Draft Advice to Government seminar. My name's Steve Dixon. I'm the General Manager of Partnerships and Strategy at Toitū. Really appreciate you coming on board. There was a lot of interest in this webinar. We had over 200 register, so I can't see exactly how many of you are on yet. It's early, but you know, really brilliant to have so much interest. And obviously, it's no surprise because this is, as they say, where the rubber hits the road for both the government, but for business and for Aotearoa as a country, as far as how are we going to respond to climate change. These are the biggest levers that we have around these budgets. I'm pleased to be joined by two of my Toitū colleagues today. First, you'll hear from Belinda Mathers. She's the GM of Technical for Toitū, and then our CEO Becky Lloyd will come in and talk a little bit about the advice and the sort of the business perspectives of this. Ashish, if you can flick a slide for me. Thank you. A little bit of housekeeping to start. So we're going to have, you see that you have a Q&A button as your spot to ask questions. You will also see everybody else's questions. Because there's so much interest in this, we're under the expectation that we won't be able to manage all of the questions in the hour we have today. So what I want you to do is to vote up the questions that you like, and that'll make sure that we ask those questions early and we get to ask our two panelists those questions live, but we will commit to answering all of the questions offline if we don't get to them all today. As an overview, we'll be looking at the Climate Change Commission's advice to government and the consultation process. We'll be providing a summary of that advice. So Belinda will be sort of doing an overview. We clearly can't get into the detail of hundreds of pages, but we will be providing that overview, and also an overview of where Toitū sits on some of the key issues that we're being asked to respond to by the Climate Change Commission. And then Becky, as I mentioned, will talk about the role of business in this and some key aspects to do with that. So as I say, use those Q&A functions. Please feel free to add comments as well if you like. Others will read those. I'm well aware that that the group on the people who've registered on this list come from lots of businesses who are well advanced in this area, and you will have your own thoughts and ideas. Feel free to share them. It doesn't have to be a question. Others will read those as they scroll through them, so it's worth putting up your ideas. If you want to send a direct comment to a panelist, you can do that through the chat option. And so here's a little sort of heads up as to what the Climate Change Commission advice is all about. So they were asked to answer three key questions. First, to provide 3 5-year emissions budgets and some guidance at a reasonably high level as to how the government could meet those. And so that is what you'll hear from Belinda as she summarises some of the suggestions and advice that the Climate Change Commission have put forward. They've also been asked to comment around whether or not the first, what we call NDC, the nationally determined contribution, is compatible with 1.5 degree targets. So this is really the government asking the Climate Change Commission, look, we've set some targets in the past, and obviously we've been setting targets on climate change for quite a long time and not meeting almost any of them. So they've now set some targets that they appear to be genuinely intending to meet. So are they the right targets, they asked the Climate Change Commission. And finally, what advice on potential reductions in biogenic methane might be needed in the future? And this is a really key question for Aotearoa because methane makes up a significant proportion of our overall national footprint. So that is what the Climate Change Commission have prepared. As far as timings around your response and what's next, there's a consultation process underway now. The advice was launched at the end of January. They've extended the deadline slightly to the end of this month, to the 28th. The government, when we've all made our comments and responded, the Climate Change Commission has until the 30th of May to present their final report to government, which we will obviously see as well. And then on the 31st of December is the government's own deadline to respond. Now, the advice is not obligatory. The government does not have to follow all of the advice around mitigation, but the expectation and understanding is that the budgets pretty much are obligatory. So there may be changes in those budgets based on our feedback and consultation, but it's expected that the government's response will be around how will they reach those targets. So, you know, nothing is compulsory for the government here, but there will be significant interest and focus on the government as to how they respond to this. And, you know, clearly there will not, in this environment of increasing interest around climate change and our response to it, they won't get away with a lightweight response. So we're expecting something pretty substantive at the end of the year. There's a little bit to do before we get there. So let's get on with it. I will now pass over to Belinda Mathers, our GM of Technical, to outline the background and sort of the first summary of what's in the draft advice. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for the introduction there. So there has been an awful lot in the media about what's going on in this space. Different people will have heard a lot, you know, different things. There's a lot of different perspectives out there. And my focus today really is on what does this mean for business? What should businesses be thinking about moving into this brave new world of reducing emissions budgets over time? So the advice that's been issued does cover the first 3 budgets. They're 5-year budgets, so that takes us up until 2035. There will be 3 more budgets that follow that, and they'll be done sort of 10 years ahead, effectively. So in another 5 years, they'll be doing budget 4, 10 years before it kicks in. So you can see that the overall emissions, that's the grey line, is decreasing quite significantly over that time period. The biogenic emissions, the orange blocks there, are reducing a little bit less, and there's some really good reasons for that, which we'll talk about a little bit further on. So just making sure that my changing is working. That's all good. So at a very high level, the advice is broken into 4 key categories. There's transport, there's heat industry and power, there's land, being agriculture and forestry, and then there's the sort of unusual mixture of waste and what they call F gases, which is fluoride gases, mostly refrigerants. So we'll cover each of those in turn, and I'll talk a little bit about, for each of those, what are the recommendations, what does that mean for business, and also how might that be tricky, what challenges might be lying ahead, and you know, what support might businesses need potentially to be able to put those things into action. So at a high level, breaking it down into those categories, you can see that there's quite varied you know, proportions of reductions that are being covered in each, or being expected in each of those categories. Transport is currently 36% in 2018 of our long-lived gases. The long-lived gases are the carbon dioxide and the nitrous oxide. Methane is not covered in that long-lived gas category. That's the biogenic emissions that are dealt with separately. So the transport emissions is the biggest reduction that's being aimed for, and it's a really big part of our footprint as a nation. Heat industry and power is buildings, it's manufacturing, it's electricity generation, and a 45% reduction over the next 15 years is what's being recommended in the pathway that's been modelled. Agriculture's been split into 2. We've got long-lived gases, which is looking at a 17%, so that's 17% reduction. That is things like the emissions from fertiliser use, as well as the carbon dioxide emissions associated with agriculture, and then biogenic methane, the effectively the cows burping, is the looking at a 19% reduction over that time. Waste, again, is largely biogenic methane, so that's the methane that is being emitted from landfills associated with putting organic wastes into our landfills, and the refrigerants is looking at a fairly, it's a smaller proportion, but it's looking at a fairly ambitious 33% reduction, and that's because there's a bunch of things already going on in that space. Balancing those reductions in our footprint as a nation, the removals from forestry are intended to be increased by close to 50% over that time. So the graph on the right there is from the advice, and it kind of shows by category what that looks like in 2018 and what it could look like in 2035. The principles that the Climate Change Commission was working to are listed here. So they needed to align with New Zealand's 2050 targets. They had a focus on decarbonising the economy, not just getting out of jail by planting trees. Creating options. So they were really thinking hard about how can we do this in a way that's possible? How can we design this in a way that's possible and works for New Zealand and works for employment and all those sorts of things? And avoiding unnecessary costs. New Zealand can't afford a whole lot of extra costs. And we need to be transitioning in a way that works for every New Zealander with a focus including low income parts of the community and Māori, as well as business and all other sectors of the New Zealand community. How do we, at the same time as reducing our emissions, how do we increase our resilience to climate impacts? We have effectively locked in a certain amount of climate change by what we've done already. So we need to make sure that we are all resilient to that, from councils through to land owners and others that could be impacted. And how do we leverage co-benefits? How do we get social benefits? How do we get other benefits alongside the emissions reductions? So it's really quite a holistic approach that they've used. So looking at transport to start with, the pathway that's been modelled suggests that we should be able to reduce our emissions from 16.6 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent down to 8.8 megatons over that 15-year period. Cars, SUV and trucks are about over 90% of our transport emissions. So really focusing on our road transport fleet is where we're going to see the biggest wins. Domestic flights are about 7%, and rail and coastal shipping are only about 2%. So the response or the advice given by the Climate Change Commission reflects those in its goal to reduce our emissions by in the transport sector by 47%. The recommendations that have been made there are that we should be aiming to reduce the amount of travel by private car. Let's take some vehicles off the road. Recognise that our population is likely to increase over the next 15 to 30 years. So we need to be reducing our per capita car use over that time to be able to reduce our emissions. To reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, there's a recommendation that electric vehicles be widely adopted, and that we look at opportunities to increase the use of our low carbon fuels, particularly biofuels and hydrogen, which may be a better option for heavy trucks, for trains, for planes and for ships, that there's not really great electric options right now. So for business, that means thinking about how can we reduce our business travel, our road travel, also our air travel, and how can we help our staff to reduce the amount that they travel. With COVID, there has been a real move to more working from home, to working in different ways. And I think that it's really important that we don't go back to the baseline that we were at before, so that we have some ways to reduce the amount of traffic or travel, particularly by individuals in vehicles with only one person in them. Where possible, we need to be moving our light vehicle fleets to EVs. Businesses and government departments and other large organisations are in a really great position to help New Zealand move towards EVs by bringing new vehicles into the transport fleet. For very many New Zealanders can't afford to buy new EVs, but do want to head in that direction. So increasing the availability of second-hand EVs certainly helps to get New Zealand going on that track, and government departments, large organisations, others with significant vehicle fleets can help. The implications for heavy vehicle transport, it's a bit trickier right now. There's not so many options in that space. So we'll be potentially looking at where can we electrify, what mode shift can we do, are there opportunities in our freight of the goods that we produce to move from road freight to rail freight or to coastal shipping, or to use biofuels. So as businesses, there's some things that are within our within our control, and other things that are less within our control. So just be thinking about what we can do as businesses. Can we travel less? Can we travel differently? Can we move our stuff around in a different way? But there are some barriers that will make our lives a little bit more difficult, that potentially government, whether it be central government or local government, might be able to support through policy or other means. And that includes public transport systems don't really work that well for transport or for mode shift in some places in particular. EVs are more expensive currently. Availability could well become an issue as more and more countries go in this direction. So there are some things that can cause challenges there. As we increase the fleet, we'll need to increase the charging infrastructure as well. And there is a bit of a limit in heavy vehicle fleet technology currently. So all those are things that can be helped, but we potentially need a bit of support as businesses to be able to implement to the great extent possible. So looking at heat industry and power, power generation from fossil fuels is about 22% of this sector's emissions. Manufacturing heat and chemical reactions, so boilers used in manufacturing processes, those sorts of things, is about 47%, so that's a really big contributor. Fossil fuel heating our buildings is 7%, so buildings that have got a diesel or coal boiler in it, or other non-renewable natural gas in many cases. There's emissions associated with coal and oil production, and off-road vehicles and machinery are also significant contributors. So a lot of this is coal being used for different purposes, whether it be electricity generation, manufacturing or heating buildings, and also for natural gas use. So the goal is to reduce emissions by 45% in this sector. And in order to do that, we need to nearly eliminate fossil fuel use across the sector. We need to have buildings and infrastructure that is more efficient, that has lower emissions technologies incorporated into it. We do need to reduce our natural gas use in homes and businesses, which is a fossil fuel. And another one, which is not necessarily what people think of in the first instance, but is managing how we use our electricity in terms of timings and peak loads. Can we manage our electricity demand to take some pressure off the grid? So as we electrify the grid, there will be challenges around having enough electricity in the right places for everybody that needs it. So one way to manage that businesses can support is to do some load management, demand response work. So for businesses, we recognise that, and the advice recognises that actually our businesses have assets that last a really long time. So they're not suggesting that we change all those boilers over to electric or other fuels straight away, but that at end of life, we do replace fossil fuel assets with renewable powered assets, whether that be electricity or biomass, and to switch to other lower emissions fuel options in the meantime. So maybe moving from coal to natural gas. In the building sector, as we have new builds or retrofits or move offices, thinking about the emissions intensity. Can we avoid having fossil fuel boilers in our buildings, and how do we make our buildings warmer so they don't need as much heating and cooling, making sure that we've got things well insulated and those sorts of things. And we've already covered off the fossil fuel heating systems. Reducing natural gas use, there is a recommendation that no new natural gas connections to buildings be installed after 2025, I think it is. So yeah, avoiding putting in new natural gas facilities is important, and looking for opportunities to reduce it. They're not suggesting that we don't use our LPG barbecues and those sorts of things. It's really focusing on the bigger emission sources. And you're looking at your electricity demand management. Can you use electricity within your business at times that the demand on the grid is lower? So there's some challenges there. I've talked already a little bit about the long asset life. There is a high cost to convert boilers over. And there may be a limit of availability of expert support or information about options. There are options out there. If you are having trouble finding the experts in that space, we certainly at Toitū will help you link up with people that can help you. Maybe us, and it may not be us. We're really about linking you with the right people. And making sure, as I said, that there's enough renewable electricity in the right places, including in dry years, is something that really is important for New Zealand as a whole. So that's not something that each business has control over, but it is something that government needs to be supporting, and really looking very hard at the grid and making sure that there is capacity in the electricity grid to be able to take on that extra electricity generation that will be needed to electrify New Zealand, and making sure that there's biomass fuels available in the right places and the right information is available about that. The low emissions buildings, embodied emissions aren't currently included. They are a really big consideration, so they potentially will be looked at down the track. And yes, so some support around for businesses around how do we manage payback times, what are the best options for us. So really information is an important thing that we probably need some support on in businesses in this space. And in the natural gas use, we need to make sure that we've got some renewable equivalent, moving from gas cooking to electric cooking, for example, may not be quite apples, for apples replacement. So that's an area that there may be a barrier as well. So waste and hydrofluorocarbons, the waste sector is, as I said before, that's looking at the biomass based emissions, so the organic material that's that goes to landfill and breaks down over time. The overall in New Zealand, landfill management is pretty good. There's some sites better than others, of course, but It's not a massive contributor to New Zealand currently, and the ability to reduce has been, I guess, judged by the Climate Change Commission to be a little bit less, so only looking at probably about a 9% reduction there to meet our goals, while the hydrofluorocarbons, the refrigerants that we're using in our buildings, in our manufacturing processes, in our vehicles, is aimed to reduce by 33%. So the recommendations are to reduce overall waste to landfill, increasing the circular economy capabilities within New Zealand, make sure that we're managing our methane capture in our landfills as well as we possibly can, and to reduce the HFC imports in secondhand products. So, for example, secondhand cars that are coming into New Zealand, making sure that we're managing or we're considering the refrigerants in those products as they come into New Zealand, and making sure that we're capturing those refrigerants well and not letting them leak into the atmosphere during it at the end of their lives. So as businesses, there are things that we can do, for example, in our offices to make sure we're not sending food waste and other organic wastes to landfill. We also should be thinking more broadly around how recyclable are the products that we're making, how can we reduce the amount of material that's going to landfill, and how can we make sure that what we're buying is recyclable to avoid the overall amount of waste going to landfill there as well. And in the refrigerant space, really making sure that systems are well maintained is the most important thing that businesses can do. If you're importing a lot of things that have got refrigerants in there, then that's something that you could be able to think about too, but that's not common for all that many businesses. And making sure that you've got the right people doing that maintenance, so that at the end of the life of the assets, that refrigerants are being well collected and appropriately disposed of. There is, as I said, there's some stuff happening in this space anyway. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol has already got some targets built into it, so that's helping in that space. So there's not necessarily too much more. It's more sort of hygiene factors in some ways in this space. The barriers in this space, and it's something that we often hear about when we're talking to our clients, is that we want to recycle more, but the facilities aren't there. That there's not enough product stewardship schemes or advice around how we can better manage our waste. There's not necessarily a great data across the sector currently. And the New Zealand waste strategy is due for a refresh. I think it was 2010 that was last updated. It's due to be updated again. The waste levy is increasing, so potentially there will be more money available to invest in the right areas of managing our waste knowledge, our waste infrastructure, and really doing some public education in that consumption space. The best way realistically to reduce waste is to reduce consumption, so that we don't have extra stuff going into the waste, to the landfills. Barriers, excuse me, in the refrigerant space include again, the asset life. So it could take some time for changes of refrigerants to end up reducing the emissions from the sector. You can't necessarily just change out refrigerants to a lower global warming potential option, because it's not necessarily compatible. For agriculture, where this has had a lot of focus in the media, and some people are saying that the expectations are too high, and other people are saying the expectations aren't high enough. Overall, it's well, the modelling suggests that reducing methane emissions by about 19% and reducing the long-lived gases emissions by 17% will allow us to meet our targets. But we need to have a strategy that covers all the impacts. It covers water, that covers biodiversity, and does cover climate. Farmers have done a great job over the last 20 years or so, reducing their emissions intensity by sort of 1% per year or so, improving the way they perform from an emissions perspective. And the intention is, or the expectation is, that there's still a bit of room to move there. The farmers can keep doing that, improving their land management practices over time. But there is really a long-term plan needed to look at how we can have some step changes in that space. So farm businesses will potentially, there is modelling around reducing animal numbers. I think the external modelling outside the Climate Change Commission was suggesting that it would be around 8% reduction in the national herd anyway, and it suggested that we could go to 15% without reducing profitability by improving the amount of whether it be meat or milk solids per animal over time. There is room potentially for some conversion of current farming land, dairy land, in particular, to either horticulture or native forest, where it's not ideal for its current land use anyway. And then over the medium to long term, there's potential opportunities for selective breeding or methane inhibitors or those sorts of technologies, but they've got a way to go. There's a lot of research still to be done in those spaces. Potential barriers. Information, advisory, guidance, tools for farmers to use, making sure that we've got the right broadband connectivity so that farmers can access the information that they need, getting the research happening around what technologies and around practices so that farmers are supported to make those reductions, and making sure that the pricing mechanism is right for those agricultural emissions as well as identified in the reports. Improved information on land management so that the farmers or the landowners have the right information at their fingertips to make the decisions they need to make, and to make sure that we not introducing barriers for exports, that we aren't making it more difficult for farmers to get their products into international markets. So in the forestry space, this is where we're looking to increase our removals. Pine trees will still be important, but pine trees are not the answer in and of themselves. And there's not enough land to be able to plant our way out of this. New Zealand does not have enough land to offset or to remove all the emissions that we are creating. So the solution will be improving existing forests, adding bits of native forestry to suitable land, and there's other benefits there too. There's other biodiversity benefits, there's social benefits that come from that increase in native regeneration. So, as I've said, an increase in new permanent native forests on less productive land will be important. But then there's the other things. There's if there's going to be more forests being planted, we need to have use for that, the pine or the exotic wood that's being produced in those non-permanent forests, so that when the trees stop growing, they get chopped down, the wood gets used, the carbon in the wood gets locked in over time, and then we plant more trees to replace them, or that we're using biomass as a fuel, particularly the offcuts and the parts that aren't useful for building sector and for other uses. Again, we've got challenges around information, around getting the sources of biomass and the markets for biomass lined up in the right places, making sure that we've actually got the infrastructure that we need for planting all these native trees. We need the nurseries to grow them, we need the people to plant them. So at that time, I will hand over to Becky, just slightly earlier than planned, but that's okay. That'll give us a little bit more time for questions at the end, potentially.
Linda, before Becky
Yeah.
kicks in, I just think looking at the Q&A, we have a number of questions, and some of them are on the technical side. So
Sure.
let's see if we can deal with a few of them at this stage, and then give Becky some space to sort of wrap up and take the business perspective. So right at the top here from Anonymous, is there a view on backup generators for businesses and what the alternative should be?
I haven't read a lot of detail about that. Backup generators typically aren't big fuel users. So in our experience in measuring for clients, yeah, they're typically only using, you know, a very small amount of diesel. So I suspect that backup generators, we might be able to go to biofuels for them, but in terms of actually having those, I think they'll probably continue for a period longer.
I think the key's in the name, backup. Hopefully
That's
you
right.
won't need to rely on them too much.
Absolutely.
Skipping down to Manjula's question regarding government subsidies, I can partially answer this. She's asked, will government subsidies be available for vehicles and energy efficiency options, solar, etc.? Well, ECA, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, is your place to go for a variety of subsidies and support, including support for businesses to do energy audits, to look at carbon transition. They can provide for big users of energy and carbon, or producers of carbon, some support in that area. Belinda, have you got anything to add to that?
Not specifically. I think that you know, some of the stuff will become clearer over time, and when this advice goes to government, then they'll obviously be required to be thinking about, well, how do we make this happen, and what support do we need to give? So I think over the coming months, there'll be a lot more information. But yes, there is need for some subsidies and for incentives to make some of these things happen.
There is a decision pending from government on electric vehicle subsidies. You'll remember the fee-bait debate from a year or so ago. That was shelved under the last term of this government, but I understand it's being rediscussed now. So watch that space around fee-baits and options there. Another quick question. Are buses considered as light vehicles? Not quite sure of the context of that particular question, Belinda. Do you know?
As far as I'm aware, the full-sized public transport type buses are not counted as light vehicles. Right. But you know, some buses would be. You know, your van-sized buses probably are, but not your yeah.
There's your answer, Anonymous. And finally, for now, what are the assumptions regarding the forestry increases, native versus exotic percentages?
The expectation is that exotic forestry won't grow significantly. Well, it will grow, but the amount of area used by it won't grow. But yeah, most of the growth, most of the increased area planted would be in native forestry.
Yeah, very good. All right, at this stage, keep the questions coming, people, and don't forget to vote up so we make sure we pick off the ones that you're most interested in. But for now, I'll hand over to our Chief Executive, Becky Lloyd.
Thanks, Steve. Kia ora koutou. I'm going to talk a little bit about voluntary offsetting and carbon neutrality and what the Climate Change Commission has to say about that. And then I will touch on what all of this means if you're a business and you're thinking about what to do about it. So on page 143 of the consultation, the Climate Change Commission has one page about voluntary offsetting. And what that talks about is it sets out the requirements that need to exist for a credible carbon neutral claim to be made. Primarily that voluntary offsetting should contribute to additional emissions reductions or removals and mustn't be double claimed. And it also highlights the complication at the moment that currently in Aotearoa, it is not possible to guarantee that those emissions reductions or removals are additional. When it says currently, what it means is actually under the Paris regime, there are some changes that are required to ensure that that's the case. And, where's this? Oh, excuse me. And that what they recommend, what the Climate Change Commission recommends, is that the government explores options for enabling voluntary mitigation and clarifies the types of claims that can be made about it. It won't surprise you that we have a very strong view that this is very important to be resolved. and I will just explain why that is. So why does it matter that organisations can access voluntary offsets and make carbon neutral claims? Increasingly, we're seeing our clients and other organisations mapping their pathways to net zero and using carbon zero as a way of articulating what they're doing to mitigate their emissions. In order to do this, they need to be able to access high quality carbon credits that meet robust science-based criteria. So, for example, in New Zealand, they might be New Zealand native forestry credits, or internationally, they might be gold standard credits. In that transition from Kyoto to Paris, the rules for accounting for carbon are changing. And that means we're moving to a nationally determined contribution, and that all of those sort of removals are going to be captured within that. So under the old regime in New Zealand, we've used the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, as the vehicle for enabling cancellation of New Zealand offsets via a Kyoto workflow, as it's called. So what the Climate Change Commission is calling for is for a new set of rules or methodologies to be established so that voluntary participation can continue. As I say, we think that's really important because we recognise the very, very important role that voluntary participants play on a number of levels. One is just the practical removal of carbon emissions today rather than tomorrow, but also the signal that this sends to the market and the leadership position that businesses are taking. And we've highlighted a couple of examples from our client base here. Other examples internationally might be Microsoft or Walmart, for instance. Additionally, there's a call for additional types of carbon credits to be allowed. So things like soil carbon, farmers getting recognition for the practices that they're using that add carbon to the soil, blue carbon, wetlands, peatlands, kelp, etc., as well as potentially non-nature-based solutions like projects to swap out coal for electricity to accelerate the transition to lower carbon economies and ways of doing business. So as I say, we think this is a really important part of the recommendations. It's only one page, but if you do submit a response, we'd like you to, if possible, amplify that this is a very important thing to get sorted out. We're also keen to hear from anyone who has a strong view about this so that we can represent those views clearly in our submission. So moving on now to the role of business and what businesses will be thinking about. There are, as Belinda's gone through all of the areas that the majority of the areas that the recommendations touch on. In terms of ways to think about this, if you are an organisation, first of all, there is a huge amount of detail in the advice. It's all based on strong evidence and analysis. There are a few surprises, but actually not that many, and it's very powerful to see the whole picture and actually quite reassuring to hear that New Zealand can meet our targets. I think in the Q&A, Lindsay made a point that kind of everything has to go right for that to be the case. And we would encourage a greater level of ambition and perhaps a little bit of contingency planning in there in the event that, for example, we can't get all the EVs that we might need in the timeframes that we might need them to electrify our personal transport fleet. The other really important point in there is that we can't, as Belinda said, plant our way out of this problem. And I think we're all pretty well aware of that. And critically, it will take a combined effort across government, business, and civil society. So in terms of what the business part of that equation can do, first and foremost, it's about accelerating decarbonisation of your organisation. And that's through, as Belinda said, moving to lower carbon transport, looking at a fuel strategy and managing that transition to renewables, addressing your process heat, addressing your building energy usage, and looking at your waste and your emissions associated with waste. So all of that is hopefully fairly apparent from the recommendations. The next part of it is looking at your pathway to net zero. So as you measure and set your strategy, putting in place a target that's grounded in science that will keep you on track with 1.5 degree warming, and mapping out that pathway, and also critically working with your supply chain to reduce your supply chain emissions. The other part of the role of business is about R&D and innovation. And again, Belinda touched on some of the innovation opportunities. We see the business community as really critical in identifying and championing some of these projects, potentially working across sectors and securing funding to transform the sector within which you operate, and showing a leadership position both within New Zealand and overseas. I mentioned just now the importance of voluntary offsetting. We are very keen to see continuing participation and leadership of New Zealand organisations in onshore and offshore removals and making those carbon neutrality claims so that you're setting that stake in the ground and encouraging consumers to come to you as a climate leader. And last but not least, in terms of roles of business, it's about promoting change, leading by example, championing change and helping others, whether that's your sector or your customers or potentially your supply chain, to make the transitions faster. And really, this is all about acceleration of what we're all already on the pathway to doing. So the implications, and this is just pulling all together everything that Belinda's been talking about, things to think about: fuel and energy use in buildings, your process heat, your industrial processing and production, and really focusing on innovation in that, looking at your light vehicle fleets, how you can shift to different transport modes and or promote uptake of electric, looking at your refrigerants, looking at your electricity and transitioning wherever possible to renewables. In terms of business travel, similarly encouraging use of public transport and low emissions alternatives, addressing your freight use, looking to increase the efficiency of your distribution networks and electrifying what you've got left, looking at your waste and improving all of your landfill management and waste generation. If you're in the agricultural space, looking at innovation to reduce particularly methane emissions and looking at land use conversions. Increasing removals with a focus, as Belinda said, on natives rather than exotics. And as I was mentioning, ideally some non-forestry options in the removal space as well. And last but not least, addressing the voluntary offsetting part of the equation. So an awful lot to be thinking about in that. Just going back to the, and wrapping up really in terms of looking at the submission that we're going to be putting forward. Broadly, we strongly welcome and support the draft advice. The areas where we think there's a little bit more work required or some further consideration required, as I mentioned, the voluntary mitigation space, making sure that that mechanism exists for ongoing voluntary sector participation. The advice acknowledges the need for behaviour change, but doesn't really go into a lot of detail about how those behaviour changes are going to be achieved, particularly things like transitioning people from private vehicles to shared transport, those kinds of personal behaviour aspects. Similarly, more work required on how that private sector finance is mobilised. So some great work done by the Aotearoa Circle and the Sustainable Finance Forum. How do we bring that to life through government policy or whatever other measures might be required? And just going back to that point about is this enough? We definitely feel there's space for further acceleration of the removals and the reduction, the decarbonisation that's in the advice. But in summary, I think what we would agree with is urgent action is required. And what's great about the advice is it sets out a blueprint. And while it may not be perfect, perhaps this is one of those situations where good enough is good enough. And the most important thing is that we move rapidly into action. So that's what I'd like to implore you all to do, is to take these recommendations on board, provide your feedback, but probably the more important thing is to take them and apply them to your organisation and work out what you're going to do to take them forward. So back to you, Steve, to coordinate the questions.
Kia ora, Becky, and thank you. All right, yes, the questions are flowing in. So let's start at the top here. How does the Climate Change Commission address the challenge around cost to consumers and businesses as we move to decarbonise our energy needs? Very much one of the keys to transition here. The cost of power and the improvements needed to the grid will all need to be recovered from end users. Are there any comments in the draft advice on this, either of you?
The advice does talk about that as being a challenge both in the just transition space and in the, how do we make this happen more broadly. The modelling shows that the costs of this are not going to exceed 1% of GDP, but that's not going to be 1% for every individual and every individual business. So working out how to balance those costs across the economy is going to be really important, and I don't think the answer to that is clear just yet.
All right, there's a question here around the scope for carbon sequestration and pasture land, which I think is talking about soil sequestration. Is there research happening in this space, and is it like to be recognised in the future? The short answer to that question is yes. There is a lot of research going into the space by Manaaki Whenua and also by Ag Research and others. Will it be likely to be recognised? Not yet, because the research isn't quite robust enough yet. And is difficult to scale across Aotearoa, but there's certainly an expectation that there will be some opportunities in this space in due course. I would recommend you go onto our website. In fact, I think we can probably send you a link to a Future Fit agriculture webinar that we ran last week, which covers soil sequestration, among other things. So watch out for that link. It should come and turn up in the comments. Lindsay Wood has a question. Thanks, Becky. Under plant transition, Belinda mentioned the issue of lack of available expertise. This is an issue that's going to hit across all sectors. What is Toitū's position on the recommendations for climate education and vocational education? So basically, where are we going to get the talent to transition? This is certainly something that's on Toitū's mind as we recruit heavily at the moment. Becky, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I don't think I have a very coherent answer other than totally acknowledge the issue, and we endorse more investment in this space, but we don't have any. As far as I know, we don't have a position beyond that, unless Belinda knows more than I do.
No, I was going to say something very similar, Becky.
Yes, indeed. So we're recruiting heavily at the moment, and probably will continue to do as businesses engage in this space. So yes, we do. We're seeking an answer to that. We engage with some graduate programs and the like, but there is certainly a feeling in the sector that we're lacking some talent, and we would really like both the migration options to open up again, but also, into some internal training and opportunities to come forward.
And just to clarify, when Steve says lacking talent, doesn't mean the people that are out there aren't talented. There just aren't enough of them, which I think we all understood. But,
Thank you for that. All right. Anonymous asks, just to clarify, voluntary organisations' emissions will not be cancelled through the ETS, ? But there will be a lot more high types of carbon available for only voluntary organisations. Becky, that sounds like yours.
That's what we would like to be true. The mechanism by which that's going to be achieved has not yet been, to use a technical term, nutted out, but discussions are ongoing, and we're confident we'll reach a point where it is clear, because I think that's the consensus, that's the outcome that we're looking for. So some changes are required to the way the ETS works, assuming we continue to use the ETS to do it. There's a consensus out there that it needs to be done. It's just how we do it that we're working out.
Very good, thank you. Belinda, one for you. Chance to talk about one of our favourite clients, I think. How can my business move to more renewable energy when New Zealand is already 85% renewable?
It's a really interesting space at the moment, the electricity sector in New Zealand, with the moving to more renewable. We do have carbon zero certified electricity products. So we've got Ecotricity, I know, is represented here today. And so there are organisations that are confident that the electricity that they're selling is all covered by renewable generation. There's the Renewable Energy Certificate Scheme, which has had quite a lot of discussion in the media in recent times about whether that's a real, impact or not. Renewable energy certificate schemes internationally have helped, but in New Zealand it would take a massive uptake before that actually drives new renewable generation facilities. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that I think potentially is going to take more than work by just individual businesses. But I guess looking at the different generators, looking at what their intentions are and what they're doing right now, and making your decisions accordingly is the main thing that you can do. But
Linda, just chipping in there, just reading the question, I wonder whether it's asking about renewable energy versus renewable electricity, because that point about 85% of our electricity is renewable, but only 60%, something like that. I can't remember what it is, of energy is.
That's right, because so much of it's fossil fuel, whether it be petrol, diesel, coal.
So although you may purchase 100% renewable electricity, you may still be using a significant amount of non-renewable energy in your fleet, etc., wherever you're burning fossil fuel. So actually, that's why electrification of your fleet, etc., and your processes is the next most important thing you can do. But it kind of depends where you're coming from on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And another area is that demand response or demand management piece. So basically Huntly needs to be turned on, or the gas generation needs to be turned on to manage peaks in electricity use. If we can reduce those peaks, then the renewable generation facilities in New Zealand can cover a lot more of our electricity needs. So trying to, as businesses, avoid contributing to those peaks is another important thing we can do.
Very good. Quick answer to you, Ruth, on your question about are the slides going to be available? Yes, they are. This is being recorded, this webinar. My apologies for not mentioning that earlier. So this will be made available on the Toitū website, and everyone registered will also be sent a link both to the slides and in fact to the entire webinar. I see a question here from Anonymous, which has been a question that's been challenging us of late and many of our clients. Do we now have a study on the effect of COVID-19 on electricity consumption? I'd like to broaden that a little bit during COVID-19. So the question perhaps is about electricity consumption, about working from home, but overall, what is the impact of what impact has COVID had on our overall climate emissions? And is there any work that we can reference in that space?
There has been some work done. I don't have the numbers to hand. We, in the latest emissions factor set published by MFE, we now have a working from home emissions factor, which estimates that, so that companies can say, well, what did we have before when we were all in an office, and what do we have now? And there's more accurate sort of person by person ways that can be calculated as well, but it's just a bit more onerous. There is a good understanding that overall our energy use reduced because people weren't traveling. So the fossil fuel use did drop during COVID. I don't have the information to hand around electricity use by people that would normally work in offices moving to working from home, I'm sorry.
And again, Toitū ran a webinar for public sector clients, which I believe is available on our website, which was very much around COVID impacts and the working from home impact and how you might measure that in your baselines and carbon budget. So have a look on our website for that, because that discusses this issue in more depth. Now, James Fuller asks, what key technologies could be rolled out to track the benefits of forestry, I think it's saying, including the split between exotic and native? Is there an opportunity for landowners to understand the benefits of forestry if they were to plant up marginal areas and gain carbon credits, etc.? Becky, shall we start with you?
I was going to say, can't you you can take that one.
Well, it cuts. The question of technology is interesting. I'm aware of obviously our farm tool will take tool that we use to do carbon footprinting of farms can take into account sequestration, and will give you an indication of how many hectares of forest that would be required to absorb your entire footprint. Other technologies that are available to actually guide farmers, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any, but that certainly doesn't mean they don't exist. So if others know of some, please throw them in the comments and in the chat, and we'll see what the hive mind knows. Anything from you, Becky, on top of that?
No, not really. That's why I wanted you to take it.
Okay. Let's talk biomass.
I understand that gap, it was identified as a bit of a gap, but the advice did say that it's clear that moving forward, there will be increased ability to measure smaller areas of planting, which has been a problem up until now. So you haven't been able to account for those sort of small patches of native planting on farms and things quite so easily as might be available.
Yeah, I'd start with the Ministry of Primary Industries. They have their famous lookup tables that provide you with basic ways of measuring sequestration per hectare for different plant types in different regions. That's where you could make a start, but as far as a piece of technology that might make it easier, hopefully someone's coming through in the chat to help us with that. All right. Last question. We're down to a minute to go, so we're not going to hit all these questions live, but we promised that we would respond to you offline, so we'll attempt to do that, but you'll need your name for us to be able to answer to you. Have we identified sources of biomass fuels here in New Zealand? What vegetations plants are we using? Cultivating them will compete with land requirements for agriculture, food, and forestry. Who would like to take that one?
I think there is a recognition that there may be some, risk of that competition between how do we use our land? Do we use it for biomass or do we use it for growing food? There are some things around that can be done sort of during off seasons and those sorts of things. It's not something I've got a great deal of information about, but we can certainly find out a bit more and come back. Oh, He Waka Eke Noa are looking into this apparently. So if somebody's put in the
yes,
chat.
indeed. Thank you, Ko from Overseer. You should know. Yeah, so He Waka Eke Noa, which is the agricultural primary sector's kind of all of sector response, has got a number of work streams, and they are touching and they are working in the space around forest sequestration and other forms of ways of measuring. Look, we've come to an end of our hour, and I'm pretty strict on these because people have got other things to do. So I'd just like to thank both our speakers, Belinda and Becky. I'd like to thank Ashish in the background for making all the technology work relatively seamlessly. Thanks, Ashish. And for all of you for attending today. As I've mentioned already, this recording will be available online on Toitū's event websites in the events area, but it'll also be sent to everybody who's registered. So thanks for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all live, but we'll make an attempt to respond to them offline. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Sure.
Thank you.